For 7 years, the local golf course wasn't just where I worked, it was practically my second home. I started there at just 13 years old, learning the basics of customer service, cleaning tables, and handling orders. Over time, it became a place where I grew up, made friendships, and even developed a bond with the regulars who treated me like family. By the time I turned 20, I wasn't just another employee. I knew the ins and outs of every process, every quirk of the place, and every routine like the back of my hand. A big part of my connection to the job was my mom. She was the food and beverage manager, a role that demanded leadership, patience, and sometimes superhuman levels of endurance. Watching her juggle everything, inventory, scheduling, staffing issues, and even complaints, taught me what it meant to work hard and take pride in your job. My mom wasn't just the manager, she was the heart of the operation. But that summer, everything changed. She decided to leave her role for a new opportunity, which left the management scrambling to fill her shoes. Naturally, all eyes turned to me. I was the logical choice to step into her position. After all, I had been there for years. I knew how everything worked, and I had even helped my mom behind the scenes more times than I could count. But there was one glaring problem. I wasn't ready or willing to take it on. I was a full-time college student, and the idea of working the kind of grueling 100-hour weeks my mom had endured during the busy season didn't appeal to me. So I declined. Instead, they brought in Addie, a bright and ambitious new hire who was tasked with managing the food and beverage department. At first, I was optimistic. Maybe she could bring fresh energy and ideas to the role. But it didn't take long for cracks to show. Addie didn't have the years of experience my mom had, and it became clear she was in over her head. The stress of her new role, combined with the pressure from Chad, the general manager, created a perfect storm. Chad, for his part, wasn't exactly a beacon of leadership. He was known for his temper tantrums that rivaled a toddler's, and his creepy behavior toward the female staff made everyone uncomfortable. Chad and I clashed constantly. He hated that I wasn't afraid to push back against his management style, and I hated that he seemed to go out of his way to make the job harder for everyone. The tension between us simmered in the background, ready to boil over at any moment. The cracks in Addie's leadership and Chad's mismanagement became glaringly obvious on what should have been a routine but busy league night. For context, league nights were the golf course's bread and butter, drawing in groups of about 80 golfers who would flood the restaurant after their rounds. It was chaotic and high energy, with orders flying in, rounds of drinks piling up, and the staff barely keeping up. Yet, it was also the highlight of my week. Over the years, I'd built a great rapport with the league members, many of whom became friends. Their generous tips made the stress worthwhile, and I prided myself on creating a welcoming atmosphere that kept them coming back. But things changed when Chad, in his infinite wisdom, decided to enforce a strict 10:30 p.m. closing time. His reasoning? Labor costs. He'd drone on about how keeping the restaurant open late was cutting into profits. Never mind that my hourly wage barely made a dent in their expenses, or that the league members were paying customers who generated significant revenue in food and drinks. Chad wasn't interested in hearing logic or considering the bigger picture. I remember the first night the new rule went into effect. Chad conveniently left it to me to inform the league members. I refused. If you want them out by 10:30, you can be the one to tell them, I told him. Predictably, he didn't follow through. When the league members were eventually told they had to leave early, they were understandably upset. These were people who had supported the course for years, and now they were being ushered out like they didn't matter. Their frustration was palpable, and much of it was directed at me, even though the decision wasn't mine. The whole situation was awkward, unnecessary, and deeply unfair. Then came Addie's contribution to the chaos. On one of the busiest league nights, she approached me just as she was about to head out for the evening. "You'll be training 2 new hires tonight," she said cheerfully, grabbing her bag and keys as if she didn't have a care in the world. I was floored. Training 1 person on a night like this would have been a challenge, but 2? With 80 demanding golfers in the restaurant? It was beyond unreasonable. "Are you staying to help with the training?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No, I have to get home," she replied. You've got this. They're new, so just show them the basics. And with that, she was gone. I was left juggling orders, complaints, and the constant hum of the league members, all while trying to teach two inexperienced employees how to navigate the chaos. It became clear within minutes that training both at the same time was impossible. I focused on one girl, walking her through the basics of our point-of-sale system before telling her she was done for the night. That left me with the second trainee, who I attempted to coach while simultaneously handling the endless stream of demands from the league members. Addie, of course, was nowhere to be found, and Chad remained blissfully ignorant of the chaos unfolding in his restaurant. As the night wore on, I realized there was no way everything could be done by 10:30. The tables were a mess, the bathrooms hadn't been cleaned, the trash hadn't been taken out, and the cash drawer still needed to be counted. To make matters worse, Addie had left me with a parting warning earlier in the evening. If you're not clocked out by 10:50, you won't be paid for any work after that. The absurdity of the situation was almost laughable. By 10:50, I was faced with a choice. I could stay late, clean up the mess, and risk not being paid for my time, or I could clock out and leave, making a point about how unreasonable their expectations had become. I chose the latter. I counted the drawer, clocked out, and walked out the door, leaving the restaurant exactly as it was. Could I have stayed to finish the job? Sure, but why should I? If they weren't going to pay me for my time, I wasn't going to work for free. As I drove home that night, I felt a mix of frustration and satisfaction. Frustration at being put in such an impossible position, but satisfaction in knowing I'd stood my ground. Little did I know, the fallout from that decision was just beginning. The tension in the air became unbearable as Alyssa stood her ground against Jack's escalating hostility. Her composed demeanor only seemed to further provoke him, his hand gripping his holstered weapon like it was the only control he had left. The murmurs from the gathering crowd turned to audible gasps as they realized the confrontation was spiraling out of control. Alyssa's voice cut through the noise, steady yet resolute. "Officer, I've already explained myself. I am Colonel Alyssa Carter, U.S. Army. This boy was lost, and I was ensuring his safety. Your actions are reckless, and I strongly suggest you stop before this gets out of hand." But Jack, blinded by his prejudice and emboldened by his position, took a threatening step forward, his face red with frustration. "I don't care who you say you are. This isn't your jurisdiction, and I'm not taking orders from you. Get on your knees, now." The sharpness of his tone startled Max, who clung tightly to Alyssa, his small frame trembling with fear. Alyssa gently placed a hand on Max's shoulder, her calm presence reassuring him despite the chaos around them. The crowd, now several dozen strong, began to voice their dissent. Some shouted for Jack to stand down, while others filmed the scene, their phones capturing every chilling second. Jack's patience snapped. Misinterpreting Alyssa's attempt to comfort Max as an act of defiance, he drew his weapon, pointing it directly at her. The crowd gasped collectively, a few crying out in protest. Alyssa remained composed, though her heartbeat quickened. "Officer, lower your weapon. You're making a grave mistake," she said, her tone sharp yet measured. "This is not how justice is served, and you're endangering not only me, but this child." Her words fell on deaf ears. Jack's hand trembled as he barked, "I told you to comply. Don't make me." Before he could finish his sentence, a small, unintentional shift from Alyssa as she adjusted her stance sent him over the edge. A single gunshot shattered the tense silence, reverberating across the park. Alyssa dropped to the ground, clutching her leg as blood seeped through her fingers. Max screamed, his cries echoing through the park as he threw himself over Alyssa in a desperate attempt to protect her. The crowd erupted into chaos. People shouted in outrage, some rushing forward to offer aid while others turned their fury toward Jack. The officer stood frozen, his gun still drawn, his face pale and eyes wide with the dawning realization of what he had done. The weight of his actions seemed to hit him all at once, but it was too late to undo the damage. Within moments, the blaring of sirens filled the air as police cars and ambulances raced onto the scene. Sheriff Roy Anderson, a respected and seasoned law enforcement officer, stepped out of his patrol car, his face a mixture of shock and anger as he surveyed the scene. Spotting Alyssa on the ground, he rushed to her side. "Kneel down and stay still," he barked at Jack, his voice cold and commanding. Turning his attention to Alyssa, he crouched beside her. "Colonel Carter, what happened?" Alyssa's face was pale, but her voice remained strong, though laced with pain. She gestured weakly toward Jack. "That man shot me. He didn't believe I was helping this child because I didn't fit his narrow view of who should be trusted." Roy's face hardened as he stood and turned toward Jack. "What were you thinking, Jack? Do you even realize who you just shot?" "This is Colonel Alyssa Carter, a decorated U.S. Army officer." Jack's expression crumbled, his hands trembling as he stammered, I didn't know, Sheriff. She wasn't complying, and I thought, enough." Roy's voice cut through Jack's weak attempts at justification. "You've embarrassed yourself, this department, and everything we stand for." Turning to the officers who had arrived with him, he issued his orders swiftly. "Arrest him. Now." Jack's gun was taken from him, and he was handcuffed in front of the crowd, which jeered and shouted their disapproval. His head hung low, the realization of his career and life as he knew it, dawning on him with each passing second. Meanwhile, the paramedics worked to stabilize Alyssa. Max clung to her side, refusing to leave despite the reassurances of the paramedics and bystanders. The chaos of the scene continued as Alyssa was carefully placed on a stretcher and taken to the waiting ambulance. Sheriff Roy stepped closer, his face lined with regret. "Colonel, I promise you this will be thoroughly investigated, and justice will be served." Alyssa, despite her pain, managed to look him in the eye. "Justice isn't just about me, Sheriff. It's about ensuring this never happens again to anyone else." The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere thick with tension and anticipation. Alyssa sat in her wheelchair at the front, her leg still bandaged from the injury she had sustained. She looked calm, her expression betraying none of the lingering pain, but her presence radiated strength. Jack sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and drawn, a shadow of the once confident officer who had pulled the trigger that fateful day. The judge, a stern woman with years of experience, read the charges aloud. After reviewing the evidence, including multiple eyewitness accounts and video footage, it is clear that Officer Jack Miller's actions were driven by bias and an abuse of power. His failure to act with professionalism and respect resulted in the unjustified shooting of Colonel Alyssa Carter, a decorated U.S. Army officer. Therefore, I am sentencing Jack Miller to 15 years in prison for aggravated assault, abuse of authority, and professional misconduct. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the sentence was handed down. Some people nodded in approval, while others whispered quietly, but the overall feeling was one of justice being served. Jack sat motionless, his head bowed as the judge's words sank in. He muttered a quiet apology, but Alyssa did not respond. Her gaze remained steady, focused not on him, but on the larger message that this moment represented. As the trial concluded, reporters swarmed Alyssa as she exited the courthouse. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in her direction, and a flood of questions filled the air. One young journalist stepped forward, her voice clear over the noise. "Colonel Carter, what does this verdict mean to you? And what message do you want the public to take from this?" Alyssa paused, taking a deep breath before speaking. Her voice, though calm, carried the weight of her conviction. "This verdict is not about my personal vindication. It's about accountability and the need for systemic change. What happened to me is a reflection of a larger problem in our society, a failure to see people for who they truly are, beyond race, beyond appearance. Justice doesn't end with one sentence. It begins with reform, education, and a commitment to treat every individual with dignity." Her words resonated deeply with the crowd, many of whom nodded in agreement. Alyssa's story had become a symbol of resilience, a rallying cry for those demanding equality and fairness in law enforcement. Months later, significant reforms were implemented in the local police department under Sheriff Roy's leadership. Body cameras became mandatory for all officers, implicit bias training was conducted regularly, and an independent oversight committee was established to investigate complaints against law enforcement. The changes, though overdue, marked a pivotal step toward rebuilding trust within the community. For Alyssa, the journey didn't end there. She became a national advocate for justice and equality, traveling across the country to share her story and push for broader reforms. Her speeches inspired countless individuals, from young activists to seasoned policymakers, to take action against prejudice and injustice. On a crisp autumn morning, Alyssa returned to the park where the incident had occurred. She sat on a bench, the vibrant leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Max, the little boy she had helped that day, ran toward her with a bouquet of wildflowers in hand. His mother followed closely behind, her face glowing with gratitude. "Alyssa," Max called out, his voice full of joy. "I brought these for you. Are you feeling better?" Alyssa smiled, her heart warmed by his innocence. She leaned down to accept the flowers, pulling him into a gentle hug. "Thank you, Max. I'm doing much better now. And you've been so brave." Max's mother sat beside Alyssa, her eyes brimming with emotion. "We owe you so much, Alyssa. Not just for helping Max that day, but for everything you've done since. You've changed so many lives." Alyssa placed a hand on the woman's. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us, everyone who spoke out, who demanded better. Change doesn't happen overnight, but together we can build a world where every person is treated with the respect they deserve." As the three of them sat there, surrounded by the beauty of the park and the hope of a brighter future, Alyssa felt a sense of peace. The journey had been painful, but it had also been meaningful. Justice wasn't just a destination, it was a continuous effort, a promise to keep fighting for what was right.